they have written themselves in sports car folklore, recognised by endurance fans around the universe, irrespective of where they be for good or bad reasons. Let's relive their story. The LMP1 hybrid era was a mini golden age for sports car racing. It was a light that burned very brightly and very powerfully for 3 or 4 years until the costs were getting too much for the manufacturers to justify spending. But in that short period of time we had 3 world-renowned car brands duking it out for overall victory, in cars that were not too far off F1 car speed comparatively, yet accelerated from 0 to 60 at about 0.01 of a second. Toyota, Audi and Porsche were the trio of brands that made these machines. However, if you were a manufacturer and wanted to have a realistic shot of competing for overall honours, then you needed to have a hybrid system. But there was a separate LMP1 category called LMP1L. This was an alternative LMP1 class for teams that either didn't want or couldn't afford to run a hybrid prototype, but given how they would be fairly comfortably off the pace of the hybrid monsters, it still gave them something to fight for. There were a couple of teams that took part in the class. The first being Rebellion Racing with its Orica-built and Toyota-engined Rebellion R1, whilst the second team would be Lotus. But not in the guise that you would perhaps have expected. The Lotus was being operated by a team called Kadewa. However, even then, that still doesn't explain fully the identity behind the team that was running this program. Because in truth, this was the ByKolles racing team. But to take a look further at who this team were, I think it's best that we go back right to the start of it all. Beginning in the year 2000, the outfit ran under the name of Team Kolles Racing and was run by Romanian-born German Colin Kolles and his father Romelis. The team's first category was the German F3 Championship, before they moved to the F3 Euro Series in 2003. They weren't running regularly towards the front of the field, but during its time in the F3 Euro Series, they ran a load of drivers that would go on to have established careers in their own right. Nick Tandy, Maximilian Goetz, Robert Wickens and Jamie Green, just to name a few. They would compete in that series for 2003, 2004 and 2009, but it was right in the middle of this period where they would be entering the DTM. For 2006, the team would have a rather miserable time, it must be said. Whilst they were using the 2004 spec Audis in the series, compared to the other Audi runners who used 2005 or newer A4s, they still would score no points. In 2007, they were once again the only Audi team to run the 2-year-old configurations, and it wouldn't help them once again, as they would score no points again. In 2008, they were running 2006 spec Audi A4s, and despite having recent F1 driver Christian Albers and recent American Open wheel star Catherine Legg driving for them, they would end the season with, well, no points, sadly. In 2009 they would once again run Audis that were 2 years old, and unfortunately at season's end they would score nothing. And that was their DTM journey over. 4 years and no points to show for it. Maybe this is why during the later years of their DTM escapade they were taking a look at the top level sports car scene. But before we get on to that, I feel it's best that we take a closer look at Colin Kolles, because whilst his racing team was still competing in Europe, he had other roles to contend with. In 2005, Colin was named as the managing director with the Jordan F1 team. Of course, as a fair number of you will probably be aware, Jordan had been on a rather steep decline at the time, and that year had been sold to Alex Schneider, who the following year would name it Midland. He helped oversee the project as the years went on, but at the same time, the tenure of Midland's F1 entry was rather short-lived. The team were then sold to Dutch sports car brand Spyker, with which Colin Kolles was the team principal. And he stayed as the team principal when once again the ownership of what was once the Jordan team changed hands again for 2008, now known as Force India. He stayed in the team principal role for 2008, but at the end of that season, he was technically no longer the team principal, although in some respects he still was. Despite playing a rather inactive role for Force India during 2009, he was still stated as the team principal that season, until he was finally let go towards the conclusion of the 2009 season, with which he was then back to his role with his own racing squad. The Force India team said during a press release that, "We thank Dr. Kolles for his contributions during his term and wish him success in his future endeavours." Kolles was also the team principal at the Hispania F1 team from 2010 to 2011. Yet in 2009, Kolles would take part in endurance racing. However, I feel that is worth its own separate video. Instead, we're going to join the story in 2014, where the team would be getting into the LMP1 ranks. The ByKolles team were building a brand new tub for its LMP1L contender, a completely separate chassis from the one that was the basis for its LMP2 entry. The hope was to try and compete for the entire 2014 season. However, those plans were somewhat scuppered because the engine that was originally intended to have been put in the car had to be changed. For reasons that haven't been publicly revealed, it's thought that the team were looking at a deal to run Audi-derived 4-litre V8 engines that were used in the DTM car at the time, but that didn't come to fruition. So instead, there was a later-than-hoped switch to a very different power plant, an AER-derived twin-turbo V6. The delay meant that the team missed out on the first round of the championship at Silverstone. Lotus's LMP head of operations, Boris Burmes, said, "As professional racers, making the decision to miss a race is never taken lightly. There's always a temptation to try and rush the development process just to be out on track. We have a great team in place, and I'm confident that this delay won't hold us back further." However, further delays in the construction of the car meant that the next round at Spa was missed also. And then Le Mans was also missed out on as well, although at least the car was revealed at Le Mans, and during its launch Boris Burmes gave more insight into why the project was delayed. "We designed the car for a V8 engine, but then we had to change. It took like 4 weeks. This engine is a V6 turbo, with radiators plus intercoolers, bodywork and side pods, torque curve, everything changed." One of the drivers confirmed for the program was Christian Albers, a familiar face amongst the ByKolles working group, and he said, "In the end of the day, we have to see how the lap times are and how competitive we are. We don't have the same budgets as the factory cars. It's too early to say whether we'll be close to the Rebellions." However, despite being named as a driver for the team, he would actually never end up driving the car in a race. In fact, there's a chance that Albers never actually drove the car in any capacity whatsoever, because midway through 2014, he would become the team principal for the Caterham F1 team. That team had been sold to a group of Swiss and Middle Eastern investors, but were advised by someone. That person was Colin Kolles, which may potentially explain why Albers was made team principal given their seemingly close working relationship. Unfortunately, as much as we all wanted to see Caterham F1 succeed, alas, they would no longer compete in F1 after the conclusion of the 2014 season. Either way, that aside, the Lotus Cadaver car would end up being called the Lotus CLM P101 and had some on-track testing being conducted prior to the car's first race at COTA. The driver lineup had also been confirmed: James Rossiter, Christophe Bouchou and Lucas Auer, who was competing in FIA European Formula 3 at the time, but did do one race for the Lotus LMP2 effort last season. Bouchou seemed relatively optimistic for the chance of the LMP1L Lotus, even against the hybrid dinosaurs in the future. "We ran 6 days with the same engine and didn't have any problems. I believe this car is really well built. We'll see here. It's really hot conditions and a hard track. We all want to do well, but we have to show this car with the spirit of finishing the race. I'm really confident and I believe we can fight with many of the other LMP1s. The question though, of course, is how did they get on? Well, it should be worth reminding everyone that the LMP1L category had 3 cars competing in it, so a podium finish was guaranteed, so long as you finished. And if qualifying was any indication, then it wasn't going to be all that rosy. The car ended up setting no qualifying time at all, as it had to sit out the session with gearbox problems. Also, just so you are aware, the way qualifying worked in the WEC was that your time was set by the average lap time of 2 drivers in one session. Got it? Good, let's carry on then. It was a spare component which they didn't have in the US, so a spare had to be flown from the UK so it could be put in the car. Thankfully the race was a somewhat more positive affair. Other than a spin caused by being on slick tyres on a suddenly wet track surface, it was a satisfactory race for the Lotus Cordero team, who ran solidly throughout, albeit not at an amazing ton of speed compared to the Rebellions. One of those would end up retiring, thus the Lotus got second in LMP1L, 9 laps behind the winner. On to the next event at Fuji, where they did set a time in qualifying, but unfortunately, the time it set was slower than all the LMP2 cars that set a lap time. And again, when it came to the race, the LMP2s were able to keep up with it in portions of the race, despite the LMP1L machine having much more straight line speed. However, much worse was to come later on. In the final hour of the race, the car had a malfunction with the fuel pump, which caused fuel to enter the cockpit of the car, and in turn resulted in this massive fire. Bushu got out of the car, but did have some burns to his eyebrows, and also burnt his left glove. The car was saved from being a complete write-off thanks to the quick response by the marshals and personnel from other teams putting the fire out. After 2 rather nerve-jangling moments, having been the driver who spun the sudden rainstorm at Kota, Bushu decided that he would take an immediate break in his racing career. The number 9 car was perhaps unsurprisingly a DNF. After over 100 hours rebuilding the car, it was off to the next race at Shanghai, where it was a 2-driver lineup this time round, with Lucas Auer and Pierre Caffer making his second start for the team, and had a decent endurance resume, earning 1 class win at Le Mans up to this point. The car qualified behind a few LMP2 entries again, and would end the race a fair way behind the winning LMP1L Rebellion. I can't seem to find any reason on why they were 9 laps down on the winner, but whilst they were seemingly a fair way behind in terms of performance of the Rebellions, I can't imagine they were 9 laps down on pure pace alone over the 6-hour time frame. On to Bahrain, where the team had a couple of new faces in the lineup. Joining Pierre Caffer this time was Simon Trummer, who was making his first sports car racing start after spending the previous few years in GP2, and Nathaniel Burton, who had also had a mostly single-seater derived career in GP2. They still though hadn't yet qualified faster than the fastest LMP2 time, and were over 4 seconds slower than the pace-setting Rebellion. The team would be hoping for a better outing than the one they had last time they visited Bahrain with the LMP2 car, but it wasn't better. After completing the first lap, the Lotus LMP1L entry would pull over near an access road because it would suffer a gearbox failure, its second during the weekend. With that cataclysmic weekend out of the way, they were probably quite glad that the next round would be the final round at Interlagos. Pierre Caffer and Lucas Auer would be the pairing once again, and there was, for once, some room for optimism. In qualifying, not only were they faster than the LMP2s, but were within a second of the fastest Rebellion. Now, that is obviously a good thing, it shows they're getting closer, but the thing that I don't understand about this comparative upturn in speed is how suddenly this happened. You see, the round in Bahrain was a couple of weeks prior to the Interlagos round, and there, they were over 4 seconds off LMP1L pole. The car at this point had struggled from a handling standpoint, particularly it seems on the balance side of things. Interlagos does have some long straights, but it also has a lot of long corners in the middle sector of the lap, which would more than likely expose any downfalls in a car's balance and handling. Maybe the qualifying laps weren't too great during the prior rounds, but I haven't found anything relating to that, although it admittedly doesn't help that I can't find any footage of the qualifying sessions. Either way, still seems a rather dramatic yet clearly welcomed upturn in performance. Hopefully this would leave them in good stead for the race. And it did seem to. It's just a shame that the gearbox wasn't so keen, as that once again developed problems. In the end, the car was classified as a DNF, having completed 60 laps, thus rounded off a part-time season to forget for the LMP1L Lotus. In the championship, unsurprisingly, they were last of 3 cars, mainly because of how they hadn't competed in the whole campaign. That being said though, whilst the car was very competent in a straight line, the cornering was a major headache for them, something that clearly needed improving on for the future. However, what exactly did the future look like for the snappily titled Lotus CLMP1-01? Well, at season's end, things were rather unclear. It was in all likelihood going to continue for 2015, potentially even a second car, but nobody outside the team knew of their plans. Yet in the latter half of January in 2015, those plans would be confirmed. The plan? A one-car entry once again, but this time without the Lotus influence. Yet the car would have a fair number of changes, particularly on the handling side. New front and rear suspension, aerodynamic and performance tweaks, and reducing the car's weight. Although one other thing that they did have was a new gearbox from X-Track, and I'm sure that they'd be hoping that this one was a tiny bit more reliable than the one they were originally using. Boris Bermes, who is now in a slightly different role as the Director of Operations for the team, said in preparation for the season, the team has worked hard at the end of last season to produce what I believe to be a highly competitive car. As always, I'm cautiously optimistic about this year, but let's see what testing brings. I know that we are up against some very well respected and well funded teams, and whilst we may be small, we're also smart and strong, and we're very serious about this opportunity. We will do our fans proud, I have no doubt about that. The team would now have a different name. It would now be entered as Team ByKolles, or as they were often referred to as ByKolles Racing. I don't know why, but I always thought that the name was a bit strange. Sure, Colin Kolles is a key player in this team, hence why it was probably called ByKolles, yet to me, ByKolles sounds like a perfume company. Anyway, without wishing to deviate any further from the subject matter, the team gradually revealed its driver lineup for the full season campaign. First up, Simon Trummer, who went on to say, "I had a great time working with the team last year. I really like the way they operate, and I know that they have made significant upgrades on what was already an impressive car last year." Later on, further driver announcements were made. Pierre Caffer would be returning, and had this to say, "We did a lot of work to the car last year, and I've seen the developments of the car firsthand. My honest gut instinct is that we have a very strong car this year. This LMP project is very ambitious, and I'm delighted to be part of this journey towards reaching our ultimate goal of having a private LMP car win Le Mans." The third announced driver would be Vitantonio Liuzzi, who not only drove for the ByKolles Lotus Run LMP2 car, but also drove for Kolles when he was the team principal at HRT in 2011. The Italian driver said, "The team management and I have been friends for years, and we recognise that WEC is difficult, and LMP1 in particular is not an easy challenge. I'm seriously impressed with the work the team has done to improve the car, and I welcome the opportunity to support ByKolles Racing and hopefully help a private team move forward and get some great results on the racetrack." However, whilst these drivers were confirmed to drive the car, Simon was the only one confirmed for the whole year, and the team were trying to find a third driver for the first round at Silverstone in place of Pierre Caffer. And just before the weekend started, they did find one, in the form of Christian Klein, who also drove for HRT for a time in 2010 under Colin Kolles' team principal role at the team. Meanwhile, the class structure for the LMP1 category had slightly changed. LMP1L and LMP1H had now become one whole group. However, there would still be a separate team's trophy for any privateer LMP1 entries. And at least initially, the ByKolles team would certainly be winning that battle, mainly because they were the only privateer LMP1 entry. The Rebellions were skipping a couple of rounds, as they decided that they would switch to the same power unit supplier as the ByKolles team's car, which were from AER. The engine change meant that they needed to rework some things on their car. Considering they were the winners of LMP1L in 2014, this might sound strange, but it seems like they were targeting to get a bit closer to the manufacturer giants for this season. This meant that ByKolles would be unchallenged, so to speak, at Silverstone, but they would still be in the same class as the Toyotas, Porsches and Audis. The question is though, how did they compare? I mean, there isn't really a kind way of putting it, to be honest. In qualifying, they would set a time that was just under 11 seconds off the overall pole time, and they were also over 2 seconds off the LMP2 pole time. They were also around that far off pace-wise to the other LMP1s in the practice sessions. Needless to say, it wasn't all that rosy so far, but the race is a different story, right? Not if you have off-camera contact on the first lap creating problems for the radiator, front right suspension and underside of the car, causing the aerodynamics to not be how they should. Bar the suspension, the damage would be repaired, but they would lose several laps in the process. all of which turned out to be in vain, as with just over 40 minutes left on the clock, the car would suffer an engine ancillary failure, meaning super sub Christian Klein had to pull the car over and retire it. Although this may have not particularly bothered him all that much, because he said after the race, "Even if we were forced to finish the race early, I had a great weekend and it was a lot of fun." So basically, irrespective of the car's current performance, he was just happy to be there. Hey look, I know the ultimate speed wasn't there with the hybrid machines, but I'll take driving a fast race car any day of the week. A not very optimal weekend for the car at this round, but Boris Burmese was looking forward to round 2. Now we're looking forward to the race at Spa-Francorchamps, and with the experience of Silverstone under our belts, we feel well prepared for the second race. And there was room for excitement, as for the weekend at Spa, the car had a new front-end bodywork configuration. The benefit in lap time that would come from this new configuration, the team said, was in excess of 25 seconds. Oh, okay, they didn't actually say that, I was trying and failing to be funny, but either way, they were probably hoping for better than what the Silverstone event had for them. Klein even said, "I think the car will thrive at Spa. The challenging track style suits it much better." So what difference did it actually make? Well, in qualifying they were faster than all the LMP2s. The bad news is that they were still 12.5 seconds off the LMP1 pole time. The race wouldn't go much better. The Yutzi started the race, but had to shorten his period in the car due to the temperature of the brakes. Further technical problems would put the car out of the race after the 2-hour mark, having completed 46 laps. What those issues were, I'm not entirely sure. Something with the rear of the car apparently, but I can't find anything more specific than that. So after 2 races, things weren't going well, from either a pace or reliability standpoint. Needless to say, this isn't how you want to start your preparation for that year's edition of the Le Mans 24 Hours. There would be some changes to the driver lineup for Le Mans. Klein was only there as a late fill-in for both rounds for Pierre Caffer and didn't contest any further races for them. However, Vitantonio Liuzzi would also not race the car for the rest of the WEC season. Not entirely sure why, but the best guess that I have is that despite the good relationship with Colin Kolles, the car's pace wasn't giving the Italian what he'd have hoped for. In some ways, it's a bit like the opposite of that Top Gear meme. In this case, Liuzzi says, "Look Colin, you are brilliant, but I don't like this." Either way, whatever the actual reason was, whether that be he had clashing racing commitments or just wanted to do something different, it left an open spot for the ByKolles entry. And that would go to then World Touring Car driver and F1 podium finisher, Tiago Monteiro. However, the Portuguese pilot is also familiar with Colin Kolles because he drove for him at Jordan and Midland when he was team principal. Basically, if you've driven for Colin Kolles at some point during your career, there's a good chance that supposing you kept his phone number, you'll be invited to race for him in the future. And in fact, the bond between these two is perhaps even closer than other drivers, because when Tiago had a very uncomfortable toothache prior to the 2005 Turkish Grand Prix, Colin was the person who treated him, because it just so happens that Colin is also a dentist, and by the sounds of it, a very good one at that. Tiago said, "I've competed in the race multiple times in the past, and I love the event. I know the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead, and I'm confident that we will make the most of the race." For this race though, they would have competition in the privateer class, as both the Rebellion entries equipped with their new engines and other bits and bobs were making their debut. The Rebellion squad's team principal, Bart Hayden, even said, "We're disappointed that the ByKolles team hasn't got points on the board. We were looking forward to chasing them down." There was one other change though. The car was now adopting a new colour scheme. Gone was the livery that looked as though it came out of a high visibility jacket factory, and in comes a shiny grey car with fluorescent yellow highlights. It definitely looked the part, but hopefully the car's speed would improve for the big race. In qualifying there was some perhaps good news. The car did qualify ahead of all 3 Nissan LMP1s, which were having their race debut. The bad news is that compared to the pole time, they were just under 20 seconds away from it. And compared to the fastest Rebellion, they were just under 10 seconds off of that time as well. The qualifying performance meant that seeing as no driver got within 110% of the LMP1 pole time, the ByKolles car, along with the 3 Nissans, would start behind nearly all of the LMP2s. The race didn't start brilliantly for the CLMP 101. For reasons which I can't seem to find anything about, they were 25 laps off the leader after 5 hours of running. However, things would get worse for them as huge amounts of smoke cascaded into the team garage. This would cost it understandably a fair amount of time, and when the race had just under 90 minutes left, the ByKolles was 115 laps off the leader, but still going. Its cause though wasn't helped by this spin, a spin that was somewhat assisted by the rear left tyre doing something it shouldn't really be doing. To add insult to injury, the spin happened at the last section, and by the time it was recognised that there was something amiss, it was too late to enter the pits, meaning poor Simon Trummer would have to get round this over 8-mile circuit at a much reduced pace. In the end, the car would get to the conclusion of the race, having completed 260 laps, 135 laps off the winner. As they however didn't complete 70% of the winner's overall distance, they weren't classified, despite finishing. However, this turned out to be completely irrelevant, as the car would actually be excluded from the event, as there was a driver weight infraction for Simon Trummer. There's no dressing up the fact that the first 3 rounds for the ByKolles team have been a bit of a disaster. However, there was potentially a sign of better things to come, as before the next round at the Nürburgring in late August, the privateer entries have been given an increase in fuel flow, which would make them a little bit faster. It obviously still wasn't enough for them to catch the hybrid machines, but might at least get them a little bit closer. Plus, ByKolles will be introducing new parts for the next round, which included a floor, diffuser, tunnels and rear wing. At the Nürburgring, it was quite possibly the CLM P101's best showing of the season in qualifying, over a second faster than the LMP2s and just over 2 seconds off the fastest Rebellion. I know in retrospect that that's not amazing, but I'm trying my best to be positive here. However, in the race, ByKolles would take a privateer victory, beating both of the Rebellions. If only that told the whole story. You see, one of the Rebellions pulled into the pits with an issue prior to the green flag being waved, whilst the second Rebellion entry had a rather unusual problem of debris getting stuck in the master switch, which meant all ByKolles needed to do was run without problems. Which they didn't, because the rear wing came off the back of the car on the start-finish straight. Luckily, Pierre Caffer kept control under braking and brought the car back to the pits without the team losing enough time to relinquish their lead to the number 12 Rebellion. Still, no matter how it comes, and despite the fact that the setbacks put them behind the LMP2 and LMGTE Pro Class winners overall, a win is a win for Pierre Caffer and Simon Trummer with ByKolles. In turn, it was also the team's first point-scoring finish of the season. Next up, Kota, and here was even more promising. They qualified comfortably ahead of the LMP2s and were within 2 seconds of the fastest Rebellion. In the 6-hour event, whilst the car did head into the garage with a gearbox issue midway through the race, the 2 Rebellions would have troubles of their own, which would put them in the garage and reduce their pace, which left Pierre Caffer and Simon Trummer to take another privateer LMP1 victory for ByKolles. And once again, who could care less about how they were behind the LMP2 winner? It was then back to Fuji for the CLM P101, the site of the car's major fire last season. Thankfully, none of that occurred this year, but in qualifying were a fair bit off the Rebellions, 2 seconds behind both of them. In the race, a Rebellion had electrical issues which promoted the ByKolles car up a place, yet with the other Rebellion having a trouble-free race, it would end up finishing ahead of the CLM P101 by a 4-lap margin. Then it was on to the round at Shanghai, where the car would qualify around 2.5 seconds off the fastest Rebellion, although there was something that perhaps helped the Rebellion squad, as they were using a more updated version of the AER power unit than the one in the ByKolles car. When this engine was first used, I'm not sure. It could have been at Le Mans or later on in the season, but it would maybe explain one of the reasons why those cars were ahead of the ByKolles entry. In the race, the number 13 Rebellion would once again be plagued by problems, which helped the ByKolles car up to second of the LMP1 privateers, but it wouldn't be the winner of the class. And that was despite the number 12 having this crash at the end of the race. The crash only cost them 1 lap of their 3-lap advantage over the ByKolles. This result would secure the Rebellion team both the teams and drivers titles for the LMP1 Privateer trophies, with a round to spare, with that round being at Bahrain. In qualifying, the ByKolles would be around 1.5 seconds off the fastest Rebellion. Then in the race, all 3 LMP1 Privateer entries suffered problems. In the case of the CLM P101, it was braking issues that meant it spent a fair amount of unwanted time in the garage. The issue meant that it would end the race second out of the 3 cars, Although considering the issues put all three cars behind the LMP2 winner, it wasn't the best event for the LMP1 privateers. The second place meant that ByKolles would end the season last in the team's championship, behind both the Rebellion entries, despite having competed in 2 more rounds. Ultimately, the CLMP 101 was not helped by how its engine wasn't quite as up to date as their competitors, had a very specific setup window, and whilst it did improve in the second half of the season, the reliability initially was perhaps what cost them a chance at maybe even winning the LMP1 privateer category. However, even then it would have only won because it competed in more rounds, and how the Rebellions too were set back from a reliability standpoint. If we were to go on pure pace alone, the Rebellions were pretty comfortably the faster package, something that would need to be improved upon for next season in 2016. For the following year, there were rumours of them potentially making a second car, but it would turn out to be that there would be a continuation of the one-car effort for the 2016 season. Boris Burm saying, "We have several updates we'll get over the winter for next season to make the next step. We made a good step in reliability, but now we have to go the next step in performance. We are on the lower side on the downforce, so we can easily make big steps. There will be bigger changes." It was confirmed that one car would be run for the season, and that at least 2 drivers would be retained from last season, Simon Trummer and Pierre Caffer. Here's what they had to say, starting with Simon. "Our goal was to get more performance from our package, and at the same time continue with our high level of reliability. I hope that we have accomplished our mission. If yes, we should have a realistic chance to go for victory at the 24 Hours of Le Mans and in privateer class of FIA WEC." Pierre meanwhile said, "Following the successful 2015 season bringing home 2 wins and another 3 podiums, we are now ready to reap the fruits of our hard work. To compete in the World Championship with such a strong and professional team means a lot to me." A third driver would also be announced later on, in the form of Oliver Webb, who had won the 2014 European Le Mans Series in LMP2. He said, "After some good conversations with the team and the direction the car is going in, I'm very excited to be involved in this project for 2016. However, with Pierre unavailable for the first few rounds, fellow Brit James Rossiter would return to the team he raced for in 2012 to 2014. A switch to Dunlop tyres was also made, which is what their direct rivals at Rebellion also ended up doing, along with the engine being the same specification as Rebellion's. There was also the prospect of a new look for the car this year, and with a bit of fairly standard editing trickery, here's what it was before to what it became. As you can see with its new chassis, the car had a much more pronounced nose, if you will, similar to an early 2010s F1 car, with some absolutely enormous canards. You certainly wouldn't want to be rear-ended by those things, that's for sure. Right, we've got faster traffic behind you. What car is it? The one with the biggest canards ever. I'll get out of the way then, why didn't you tell me sooner? Hopefully these things will fix the handling and balance setbacks that this car had. In qualifying, the ByKolles may only have just finished ahead of the LMP2 pole sitter, but it did end up first of the privateer LMP1s, although that was somewhat guaranteed given the Rebellions didn't set times from 2 different drivers. In the race, however, the CLMP 101 would have hydraulic issues that would harm the ByKolles team's cause, or maybe it was a rear suspension failure. I saw both things being mentioned on different places, but either way, the upshot of whatever problem they had though is that they would be 11 laps behind the winning Rebellion. Reliability strikes again, it seems, for the Austrian flagged entry. Boris Burm saw the bright side though. Finishing the race is particularly important for us. The team did a perfect job, and the drivers provided us with extensive feedback, which we will take into account in the further development of our CLM P101 AER. Indeed, the new era was creating a positive impact, which for sure would make a positive difference for the next event at Spa. After engine problems would plague the car in FP1, the car would end up qualifying around 2 seconds slower than the fastest Rebellion, although this incident wasn't very helpful at all. In the race, whilst they were comparatively speaking not too far off the Rebellions in terms of pace in the beginning of the race, unfortunately, more engine gremlins would slow them down in the latter stages, and they would finish 5 laps behind the leading Rebellion, which would have yet another great finishing position overall, with their 2nd podium in a row. Not great news for the ByKolles team, of course, heading into the biggest event of them all. Simon Trummer said going into the Le Mans 24 Hours, "We haven't used the tyres to their full potential yet, and there are some issues to be solved regarding the reliability of the power unit. but also added, "Driving the car, you notice that we have already made some aerodynamic and mechanical improvements." So needless to say, the best thing that the team could do was hit the ground running and complete a load of laps at the Circuit de la Sarthe. Well, that's probably not quite what was hoped. A leaking fuel pump caused the ByKolles to catch fire down the long Mulsanne Straight. It suffered a fair amount of damage, but it was in a repairable state. Yet the knock-on effect of this is that they would spend less time on track and missed one of the qualifying sessions. Plus, when they did set a time, it wasn't exactly a competitive time. Unlike their rivals in the Rebellion, who actually qualified pretty impressively given their privateer status, for ByKolles, they were 14.4 seconds off pole, and given how Simon Trummer couldn't set a time within 110% of the pole sitter's effort, it meant they'd have to start towards the back of the grid. However, they wouldn't even start there, as the car was having some repairs done in the garage when the race started, before coming out of the pits just before being lapped for a second time. Pierre Caffer was back after Oster filled in for him in the prior 2 rounds. Past the halfway point of the race, and ByKolles was apparently in major strife, with an engine that was down by around 100 horsepower and losing a lot of speed as a result. And despite both Rebellions having problems too, the CLMP 101 gave up the ghost before it was able to capitalise on any small chance at the privateer LMP1 honours. With under 7 hours and 45 minutes on the clock, the car caught fire for the second time this week, this time with some sort of engine problem, although I can't seem to find what the specific issue was. The result of this year's Le Mans 24 Hours endeavours? They ended up completing 206 laps, with their overall finishing position being in 53rd place. With another dispiriting weekend out of the way, it was off to the Nürburgring. In qualifying, they ended up being in between the 2 Rebellions, as well as being— hold on a second. The almost never-ending disappointments I was talking my way through almost made me gloss over a fairly major accomplishment. On pure pace alone, the ByKolles CLM P101 had out-qualified a Rebellion for the first time. Okay, maybe we can now start to build up some positive momentum in this video again. In the beginning portions of the race, the ByKolles was leading the race ahead of both the Rebellions. And sure, they did drop behind both of them by the halfway stage of the race, but as we entered the second half of the 6-hour sprint, they caught fire once again and retired from the race with an engine issue. Well, so much for me trying to lift the mood. Reliability was a huge problem for this car. Suddenly, after last year, where the car was faulty at the start of the year but gradually improved as it went on, this season has practically been non-stop gremlins. And it's not like the car was going to get a respite either, as the next round was at the new venue of the high-altitude Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez in Mexico City. Although there was perhaps some glimmer of hope/respite, as for the rest of the year, Rebellion were slimming their car count to 1 entry, obviously giving ByKolles in theory a greater chance at getting better results in the privateer LMP1 division. In qualifying, the ByKolles was just over 1.5 seconds slower than the Rebellion. Then in the race, the ByKolles had an incredible start, getting ahead of not just the Rebellion, but both of the Toyotas on the run to turn 1. I mean, they weren't behind for long, but at least they can say that for a bit of time that they were mixing it with the factory hybrid animals. However, the Rebellion would pass it after around 15 minutes, and then the ByKolles would have more mechanical issues, which meant that they would finish 19 laps off of that car. Kota would probably be the car's best showing so far this season. It's a shame that even this wasn't anything to shout home about. In qualifying, they were within a second of the Rebellion, although they were also called to the pits during one of the practice sessions because their cockpit temperature was too high for the current regulations. In the race, ByKolles didn't really challenge the Rebellion, and were even behind some LMP2 runners, but were only 4 laps off of the LMP1 Privateer Honours this time round. Fuji next, and this time they were within a second of the Rebellion in qualifying for the second event in a row. This was how their race though was going after the 2-hour mark. Engine issues caused it to retire after 79 laps. This just left the Rebellion to have a fairly easy time of it and claim another privateer honour, along with win the championship in the same category. Things weren't looking great in Shanghai either, as the car stopped on track during free practice 2, despite actually setting a faster time than its rival in the same session. But in the time session where lap times counted most in qualifying, they were over a second slower. In the race, there was a misfire, but for once, it was in the Rebellion that suffered that gremlin and had to spend time in the garage, before an injector failure put that car out of the race entirely. This finally gave a victory this season for the CLM P101 and ByKolles, despite themselves having overheating issues. It wasn't trouble-free, but finally some positivity from this season, something to make me build upon confidence-wise for the final round in Bahrain. In qualifying, the Rebellion was unchallenged, as engine issues led to the ByKolles CLM P101 missing the session, therefore meaning they'd have to start at the back. After cutting their way through traffic, they had a fairly dull race, with no obvious problems to note, which is certainly a bonus, just a shame that so did the Rebellion. And with the car once again being the quicker package this weekend, they would win the privateer battle once again, giving them an utterly commanding victory in the drivers and team standings for that season. But still, with the other Rebellion having not taken part in the last 5 rounds of the 9-round season, it meant that ByKolles had a very decent chance of collecting second in the team standings. Which they did, by 5 points. Yes, I know the number 12 entry did earn the coveted victory at Le Mans, which is worth double points, but even so, that just about emphasises what an utterly awful season it was for this car. Equally though, you could argue that in theory, things could only get better from here. After 2016 was a year that won't live long in the minds of ByKolles fans around the world, 2017 would hopefully yield something different. A combination of better performance and the reliability to go with it. A combination that seems to have been somewhat elusive for this car. But Boris Burmese was somewhat more positive in terms of seeing better results this year. We will definitely be back in LMP1 Privateer with an updated version of the car. Design is already well underway, and we have a testing program that should start soon after the end of the 2016 season. There was also interesting news in that former BMW F1 driver, Robert Kubica, would be driving the CLM P101 at the post-season rookie test, and afterwards was confirmed for a drive with the team for the 2017 season. The team would also be switching to Michelin rubber from Dunlop. There was though another rather important development in their 2017 plans, as Rebellion would be racing in LMP2, and with nobody else coming on board for this season, the ByKolles would be the only privateer entry. A guaranteed victory in that subcategory, except they wouldn't, because that privateer class wouldn't exist this season, as there weren't enough entries. Therefore LMP1 would become one whole class, which meant something else. Their direct competitors would be these lot. Do you see the size of the challenge that the team would be facing here? But still, it was a sizable coup for the squad to earn the services of Robert Kubica, who would be joined this season by returnee Oliver Webb, and someone who has prior experience with the team in the LMP2 class in their Lotus days with Austrian pilot Dominik Kreihammer, who had also actually driven against ByKolles in the past few seasons with Rebellion. Here's the now customary driver quotes, beginning with Robert. At the end of last year's WEC season, I was able to do my first laps behind the wheel of the CLM P101. I felt comfortable in the car very quickly and was able to increase my pace accordingly. The WEC is racing on circuits that I know well from my time in Formula 1. The exception is Le Mans. I've heard so many good things about the event. I'm very excited about my first start at this 24-hour race. For Oliver, to be competing at Le Mans once again with Robert alongside us is going to be fantastic. It's a dream come true! And finally Dominik. At last, I'm back in the top class of prototypes, although so far I have little experience with the CLM P101 Nismo. Now yes, you are reading that last bit correctly. ByKolles was now going to be using Nismo power plants, a 3-litre twin-turbo V6, similar to the ones that were used in Nissan's short-lived LMP1 program. Of the change, Boris Burmese said, "Engine supply from Nismo is of great significance to our team. After having to deal with many setbacks in the past due to engine reliability issues, for the 2017 season, we're expecting a significant improvement in terms of both reliability as well as performance. We're already looking forward to the first test with our fully revamped CLM P101. For this year, we are looking to clearly demonstrate our improvements and continue to develop our CLM P101. There were even hopes of making their car available to customers in upcoming seasons. With that thought, let's get into how the team and 3 drivers would get on at Silverstone in the renamed Enso CLM P101. Unless you're Robert Kubica, who decided to stand down from his full season drive with the team. He said of the development, "After the prologue, I've decided to interrupt my racing program with the ByKolles team in LMP1. Therefore, I will not take part in the upcoming WEC Silverstone opening round and in the other WEC races. Now, you're probably wondering what happened in the pre-season prologue that may have had a part to play in his decision. Well, when you don't set any laps in the car during the prologue, with your teammate only completing 6 laps before having a rear wing failure whilst exiting the pit lane, along with further detached bodywork, and a spare shortage to boot, along with being unable to continue the test on the second day, maybe Kubica decided that this just wasn't for him, so someone else was required to fill in that seat. Fellow F1 driver Pastor Maldonado was in the team's garage during the prologue, but ultimately the seat for the first 2 rounds at least went to James Rossiter, who did exactly the same thing last year. At Silverstone, it was of course entirely unrealistic of the ByKolles to be fighting with the pair of Toyotas and Porsches, but if they could at least get closer to them than they had done in previous years, then that would be some good progress. And in qualifying, the gap to the overall pole time and ByKolles was the closest it had been. 7.9 seconds was the gap. Unfortunately though, some of the new LMP2 machines did outqualify the car, and in a very ironic turn of events, one of those LMP2 entries was from the Rebellion squad. That team has caused ByKolles so much trouble, it's unbelievable. In the race, it wasn't a particularly spectacular affair, running most of the time around the LMP2 field, but that was until the final hour when the car got involved in a collision at the entry to the pit lane with one of the GTE Pro class Aston Martins. The damage to the front of the car was severe enough for it to be classed as an official retirement. Then it was Spa, where the team were bringing new bits to the car. Still didn't help them in qualifying, as they were still slower than some of the LMP2 cars, including one of the Rebellion entries again. That's not to mention how they were 9.7 seconds off of the overall pole time. And it's not as though the drivers weren't trying either. In the race though, things were a bit more positive. They ran with basically no problems, managed to fairly comfortably get a gap over the LMP2 field and earn 6th overall. The car also managed to achieve a record at Spa in the WEC, with Oliver Webb reaching the highest speed for the Spa WEC event at 320.6 km an hour, or 199.2 miles an hour. They were 12 laps behind the winner, a gargantuan gap for cars in the same class, but for a small privateer team that wasn't a surprising outcome. However, if reliability was going against the big manufacturer-backed hybrid efforts, then an overall podium at Le Mans might be possible, although luck would have to be on their side. But James Rossiter wouldn't be there with them, as he had commitments over in Japan for Super GT and wasn't approved to take part in the race. This seemed to make Boris Burmers less than impressed. We deeply regret that James had to call off his participation at Le Mans just to attend a test in Japan. Although if it's any consolation, the person they replaced him with was a pretty impressive alternative. Italian driver Marco Bononomi, who had recently driven for Audi's factory LMP1 program. Bononomi said, "I am very happy that I am allowed to climb into the ByKolles racing car for the best and most important race of the year. I would like to thank the team for giving me this chance. I cannot wait to race an LMP1 car at the South again." So for the biggest race of the year, the ByKolles had a clear goal in mind. And in qualifying, they got 1% of the way to achieving that goal. They not only qualified ahead of the Rebellion LMP2s, but all of the LMP2s by over a second. Granted, they were over 9 seconds off the overall pole time, but that wasn't the important thing for them. They were hoping for reliability to play a factor, whilst they went at their own pace and played the long game. They got 2% of the way there when they overtook one of the 3 Toyotas at the start, but when they got to Tetra Rouge, the team would get no further than 2% towards their aim. The bollards on the exit of the corner led to a front left puncture. This in turn caused front end bodywork damage, which led to a lengthy and smoky lap around Le Mans. Whilst Oliver Webb did get the car back out, there were engine issues as well, which meant that the team had to retire after having completed 7 laps. That in itself is a rather dispiriting result. Several hours of running in preparation towards the crown jewel event to ultimately have your race ended on the first lap. However, what might have made this result even more agonising is that the 5 hybrid machines all suffered problems during the race, losing several laps in the process, to the point where an LMP2 car almost won overall. If, and I know this is quite a big if, but if the ByKolles Enzo CLM car had had a race of no technical gremlins or off-track excursions, then we could have been talking about a scenario where ByKolles could have won the 2017 Le Mans 24 Hours. Boris Burmers even said, taking into account the numerous problems the manufacturers encountered, it could have been our big moment. A story perhaps of what could have been.
And ByKolles win the 2017 Le Mans 24 Hours. Toyota and Porsche humbled.
Anyway, with that out of the way, it's on to round 4 at the Nürburgring GP circuit, where things didn't get a whole lot better. The team suffered with heavy vibration issues throughout the weekend, affecting all 3 drivers, which slowed them down. The lineup being exactly the same as the one they had at Le Mans. So despite once again pushing the car to the limits, in qualifying they were 9.3 seconds off the pole and were behind most of the LMP2 runners. The race was just as much of a struggle, finishing behind a lot of the LMP2 runners and 22 laps down on the eventual winners, without seemingly having any major technical issues. Just a continuation of the handling issues that the car experienced earlier in the weekend. This, however, would be the last event of the year for the ByKolles, as the team decided to skip the remaining rounds of the season, all of which were based outside of Europe. Instead, their plan was to use the time away to focus on improving the car. And although Porsche were heading out of the WEC, they were going to be joined by a whole host of new non-hybrid privateer LMP1 entries. So even if Toyota were in all likelihood going to be ahead of those privateer efforts on pure speed, at least ByKolles had as many as 5 other privateer entries to race against. Of the upcoming WEC Championship, called the Super Season, that would go into 2018-2019, Boris Burmers said, "We significantly changed and improved our package in recent months, and our Enso CLM P101 car has been provided with extensively tested updates so that we can expect to be at the top in a competition which is becoming more and more exciting." There was a change in the driver lineup. Oliver Webb and Dominic Cryhammer stayed, but would be joined at Silverstone by Tom Dillman, an F1 Vita Series stalwart who had driven in Formula E and LMP2 machinery prior to getting the ByKolles gig. Towards the end of 2017, the new car had been put through its paces in terms of testing, with Burmers seemingly rather enthusiastic. Our latest developments have brought precisely the progress that we expected from them. Prior to the new season though, the ByKolles squad would have a new team principal, Italian Manfredi Rivetto. He though has experience with Colin Kolles run racing projects, having replaced Christian Albers as the team principal of the Caterham F1 team in 2014. Don't worry though, Boris would remain with the team, but now in the perhaps less public role of being the head of race, test and general operations. The team were planning on running a second car after the 2018 edition of the 24 Hours of Le Mans, but for whatever reason that ended up not happening. Still, they did have one car, ready for the first round at the phenomenal Spa-Francorchamps, and according to Rivetto, they weren't daunted at all. The team worked very hard over the last months, and all I can say is that we are ready to fight. We respect our competitors, but today, none of them is giving us a sleepless night. Well, let's see how they got on, beginning with qualifying, where out of the 5 LMP1 cars not to have issues, they would end up in 5th place. But if you look at it this way, compared to their car last year, they've improved their time by over 4 seconds. In the race, they were amongst the battles. However, drama would occur in the pit lane after the car would have a small fire, and although the flames were put out, one of the mechanic's fire extinguishers got caught in the rear wing. They did continue, but did lose time throughout the race, and would ultimately finish the event 5 laps down in a decent 4th place. But then, it was on to the big one once again, and a chance at redemption. The heavily updated car for this race meant that from a pure speed perspective, this was their best chance at earning a decent result. A win was a long shot, but with the Nismo Cosworth engine getting tweaked to now produce 700 horsepower and a better aero package, then this was the best the car had looked so far. Yet in qualifying, once they had fixed an exhaust issue, they would finish 8th in LMP1, 7.1 seconds off of pole, but would be ahead of the Ginettas. However, how would they get on from 8th place? Well, we weren't going to find out, because on the grid, the Enso CLMP 101 just didn't want to play ball and wouldn't start, until very inconveniently, it would get going once all the cars left for their formation lap. Only for Tom Dillman to then have a spin coming out of the Dunlop chicane on cold tyres, trying to catch up to the back of the field, where it would actually start the race. As the race progressed, they would make progress up through the GTE and LMP2 fields. That progress would come to a shuddering halt after 4¼ hours of the race being completed. Going around the Porsche curves, the ByKolles had contact with one of the GTE and Porsches, removing most of the rear bodywork, before losing control and sending Dominic Kryhammer careering into the tyre barriers. Thankfully, Dominic got out of the car uninjured, but the same couldn't be said for the CLMP 101. Their race was over after having completed 65 laps, and as it would later turn out to be, Dominic wouldn't be racing that car again for the rest of the season. Nevertheless, the team would still be testing a different aero package for Silverstone and would have a 2-driver lineup for the race, Oliver Webb being joined by René Binder, an F1 single-seater stalwart like Tom Dillman, and was also taking part in select IndyCar races that year as well. The car leaked some oil onto the track during the first practice session, which cost the team track time. In qualifying, they were within 5 seconds of the pole time, but would end up in 8th place. In the race, they wouldn't have a great time of it, ultimately retiring from the race after a full course yellow led to René Binder trying to avoid an LMP2 car, and in doing so, hitting the wall just before the bridge, and causing enough damage for the car to be classed as a retirement, having completed just over 2 of this race's 6 hours. Tom Dillman would rejoin Oliver Webb at Fuji, and so did James Rossiter again. This round would give what was potentially the best showing from a qualifying perspective for the Enso CLMP 101. P6, but within 3 seconds of the pole time. Okay, I know in racing terms that that's still not particularly great, but by this car standards they were well within the fight. In the race, it was a very uneventful time, which again is probably something that would have been welcomed. They finished 11 laps off the winner, but would end up in 5th place. The same trio would return to the next round at Shanghai. In qualifying, they were just over 3 seconds off the pole time, however they were a little bit adrift of the fellow privateer entry ahead of them and would start in P8. The race was plagued heavily by rain, particularly at the start, and Tom Dillman would slide the ByKolles car off in these tricky conditions. But to be fair to him, so did pretty much everyone else. However, that was the least of their issues. Neither was this moment on pit road. No, with just under 2½ hours remaining, the car would stop on the pit straight and have a small fire, which led to the car's retirement, having completed 50 laps. Although the car would still have its windscreen wiper going whilst it was being extinguished. The next round was at Sebring, although, as it turned out, ByKolles would be making the trip stateside. Apparently this was due to the team having a complication with a third-party supplier, leading to the ByKolles squad going over the shipping deadline for air freight. So disappointingly, there would be no experience with the Enso CLMP 101 at the bumpiest race circuit ever. However, luckily they did rejoin for the next round, which was the championship's second visit to Spa of this super season. Although in truth, Spa was doing its best to become a ski resort, with snow and hail falling at many different points throughout the race. But before we get into that event though, there is an important thing to note, as ByKolles had now switched to a new power unit. Out goes the Nismo/Cosworth 3-litre turbocharged V6, and in came a Gibson-powered 4.5-litre V8 engine, the same engines that were used in some of the other LMP1 competitors, namely the Dragonspeed entry and the Rebellions. Revetto said of the news, "Everyone saw the tough time we suffered in recent race weekends, and it's time to move on to a new chapter. We are very confident that a Gibson-powered ByKolles Enso will reward us with the results that our relentless work and investment deserve." The car would obviously have had little time to test how this package would fare, so Spa was going to very much be a 6-hour test event, although the intriguing weather conditions would make gathering relevant data quite tricky. Either way, Oliver Webb and Tom Dillman would be joined by a new face to the squad, an experienced endurance racer in Italian Paolo Roberti, although most of his endurance experience came from the GT side, rather than the prototype side. Even so, he was more than qualified enough to give some feedback. The car being used at Spa though was a chassis that was meant for the Nismo Cosworth engine rather than the Gibson. The team would instead have a new chassis for Le Mans that was designed for the new power plant. So in essence, the 2019 Le Mans 24 Hours would be the first event for this new chassis/engine combination. In qualifying, the ByKolles car was in the middle of the LMP2 field time-wise, and just under 8.5 seconds off pole. In the race, conditions were tricky for everyone, yet the ByKolles' race would not go according to plan again after a collision with one of the LMP2 runners led to it hitting the tyre wall at the La Source hairpin. Ultimately, they would finish last overall, but did at least finish, albeit 38 laps down on the winner. Not the best preparation for Le Mans, but hey, let's see what the team's fortunes would be this time round. For qualifying, it was yet more disappointment, starting in P8 and with a lap time that was 7.6 seconds off pole. Although if it was any consolation, they would actually start in P8 this time, rather than at the back of the whole field. At the start, they would go with a slightly alternative line across the Dunlop chicane, but afterwards would begin to settle into somewhat of a rhythm. That was until the start of the 6th hour, where the car tumbled down the order due to a water leak, and having to remain in the garage. It was repaired, but then the water leak returned after an hour of running, spending more time in the garage to fix the issue. Then with just over 11 hours remaining, the car pulled over, stuck in a false neutral due to a gear selection issue, which was a gremlin that would force the car into a retirement. The trio of Oliver Webb, Tom Dillman and Paolo Roberti were out of the race, having completed 163 laps in the Enso CLMP 101. Another outing for the ByKolles team to forget. In fact, Tom Dillman had this to say: "We missed mileage to find these issues before Le Mans. The car was finished way too late, just before Spa. It should have been finished earlier. That was the plan. We were not ready." In the LMP1 Teams Championship standings, ByKolles came in 4th place out of the 6 teams in the championship, albeit one of those teams only competed in one round. The ByKolles team collected 22.5 points from the 7 races they competed in during the 8-round season. In the meantime, it was confirmed that the team wouldn't be entering the next season of WEC for the full season. They were hoping to lodge entries for certain races, such as that season's Le Mans 24 Hours. However, the regulations said that LMP1 entries couldn't be entered on a race-by-race basis. The reason why they wouldn't be entering the full season during 2019 and 2020 was that they were hoping to enter WEC's exciting new hypercar era, and wanted to focus their time and resources towards that effort. Ravetto said, "The new regulation is much more favourable to private teams than the current one. Dr. Kolles wants to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and I have no doubt for a second that he will achieve it someday. It's just a matter of time and being able to put all the ingredients together." Indeed, ByKolles were looking for people to join their team to help them on their exciting new venture. One job they were hoping to fill was a hybrid application engineer, where their role would entail doing things such as compare all different hybrid concepts available and provide technical expertise for the selection process. It seemed as though hybrid powertrains were almost necessary if you wanted to have a competitive LMP1 or hypercar. Of course, for smaller privateer efforts, hybrids are much more expensive and potentially even out of reach entirely. Again, for the hypercar category, it became possible for an entry to compete without a hybrid system, should any team wish to do so. But with the team seemingly looking at people who had knowledge of hybrid systems, then that would indicate that a hybrid powertrain was what they were potentially going to use. Yet in the end, the team would be using the same Gibson engine that they had just used in their LMP1 car. Meanwhile, whilst their work with the hypercar was going on, they would be given an entry into the 2020 Le Mans 24 Hours, having initially been on the reserve list. They would also enter the round at Spa prior to Le Mans. The Enso CLMP 101 had been given a few updates, as well as a few tests, and there were fewer competitors in the LMP1 class this time round, so perhaps, if everything went smoothly and they had reasonable speed, overall podiums might not be out of the question. Oliver Webb and Tom Dillman returned, but this time were joined by former DTM champion Bruno Spengler. However, despite Bruno's vast experience in endurance racing, this remarkably was his first Le Mans 24 Hours, and prototypes were quite a new thing as well for him. However, he seemed very excited by the prospect. "I know endurance racing. I've raced at the Nürburgring and have taken part in the North American Classics in Daytona and Sebring. Now, finally, my debut at the greatest endurance race will follow. The excitement for my debut in Le Mans is increasing with every kilometre in the car." Spa was basically going to be one big test session for the ByKolles, but in qualifying it was a pretty decent showing. Although they were the slowest of the 4 entered LMP1 cars, they were only 2.3 seconds off pole. It was also a fairly positive start in the race, even managing to overtake the struggling Lone Rebellion entry. However, any good news that came from that would be eradicated within the completion of the first hour, as an electronic issue with the rev limiter slowed the ByKolles down. It then had to go into the garage during the final hour for repairs to the engine bay. They would get to the finish, albeit 17 laps down on the winner. Now surely, the curse that had been striking this team at Le Mans was going to end soon. The same driver trio heading to the Circuit de la Sarthe to give the Enso CLM P101 its last chance at completing this prestigious race. And if it could get an overall podium, then superb. In the third practice session, things would go less than smoothly, as Bruno Spengler would have an off-camera shunt at Tetra Rouge, which would cause a fair amount of damage to the car. Then in qualifying, they were last of the 5 LMP1 contenders, 7.7 seconds off the overall pole time. On race day, or I guess first race day, it became clear that whilst the car was faster than the LMP2s, it wasn't able to match the other 4 LMP1 runners for pure speed. However, nearly 4 hours into the race, an alternator issue would put the car in a garage, putting pay to any hope of an overall podium. Of course, if the issue could be fixed, then hopefully the car would still be able to finish, and the car would indeed rejoin the race. Just after the beginning of hour 7 though, the curse struck again. A rear wing failure coming down the fast S's section spun Bruno Spengler into the barriers at fairly high speed. Remarkably, despite getting lifted off the track and into a marshal area, the car did restart, and Bruno tried to get the car back to pit road, hitting the barriers once again in the process. Whilst he did get the car back to the team garage, the race was run after completing 97 laps, and thus ended yet another attempt to finish the Le Mans 24 Hours. I mean, I know I've said this already, but I wish I could be more positive than this. Maybe the new hypercar era would bring more opportunity for ByKolles, with a new car being constructed. The results of that though, will end up being in a video in a not too distant future. That, however, is going to be it for this video. Well done for getting to the end, or if you didn't and just skipped most of it, then I completely understand. However, before I go, I have a couple of important things to mention. Firstly, I want to enormously apologise for the lack of uploads recently. A lot of things have been going on behind the scenes from a YouTube perspective that I have wanted to sort out, which have also included the creation of this video, which has been 2 months in the making. And to get this huge project done before Le Mans starts, I haven't been able to do any other videos in that time. So no, I haven't disappeared, but I'm very sorry for leaving you guys without content for a fair while and kind of leaving you in the dark a little bit as to where I've been. Secondly, the channel's appearance will be a bit different in the hopefully nearish future. The name will be changed to Tie-Dye Racing, and the channel icon picture and channel banner will be changed too. It does mean that the 2016 Manor MRT05 pictures will be replaced with something that looks a little bit more professional. But don't worry, it doesn't mean that my view on the car hasn't altered from it being the best racing machine ever created. And finally, I'm going to have an update video regarding a few other things that have an impact on my channel coming out in the not too distant future. It's mainly just so you all know where things are at with my channel at the moment. If you did enjoy this video though, I would be very appreciative if you did hit the like and subscribe buttons, as, like I said, this has been a long time in the making. And once again, I'm very sorry for not having uploaded in a long time. I hope that in the nearest future my uploading schedule will become a bit more consistent. However, thank you ever so much for watching, and until the next video, be kind to each other, enjoy the rest of your day, and enjoy this outro too.